The thesis for my essay is, the school compositional effect is a substantial impediment to school effectiveness for disadvantaged student populations. The compositional effect is the impact of a student body on its own average academic performance. It contends that the demographic profile of a school influences overall performance. The simplest way of measuring school composition is to calculate the average socio-economic score, like the ICSIA score on the MySchool website. A way to conceptualise the compositional effect is to imagine the performance of three siblings, one enrolled in a low socio-economic status or low SES school, one in a middle SES school, and one in a high SES school. The compositional effect would tend to differentiate the performance between these three siblings, favouring the student in the high SES school, followed by the student in the middle SES school, despite all three having the same family background. It is an important field of research as it explains a substantial amount of variation in academic performance. It is well established that socioeconomic status is one of the largest predictors of academic performance, but this is often thought of in terms of individual student background. But the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, has consistently found that by the age of 15, for many countries including Australia, the socio-economic background of a student's peers is more important than their own background in predicting academic performance. You can see this in the PISA graph on the left of my slide, which shows that in Australia, in the 2003 dataset, the academic effect of school composition was twice the effect of individual student SES. A meta-analysis by Ewick and Sleeges, published in 2010, found that the compositional effect had an average size of 0.32 across all studies. This means that probably 10% of the variation in student academic performance within a population is due to school composition. Some research suggests that the impact may be higher for some disadvantaged groups, but this is not conclusive as other research finds the effect is the same for all groups of students. Another reason why this is an important field is that PISA shows that the compositional effect varies between countries, again seen in the PISA graph on my slide. So public policy is likely responsible for how strong the effect is. The latest PISA results in science show Australia's compositional effect is stronger than the UK, New Zealand, Canada and the US. The lowest effects are found in Scandinavian countries. The public policy of school choice is commonly credited as a factor explaining some of the national differences in the strength of the compositional effect. In Australia, we have a lot of school choice for middle and high income families. School systems that segregate students from low socioeconomic backgrounds likely have higher compositional effects. A methodological issue I want to touch on is how the compositional effect is measured. Without going into the statistics, a common method is to make a distinction between how much of the variation in academic performance in a school system is due to individual level of socioeconomic status and how much is due to the average socioeconomic status of each school. This is how PISA has been able to find that school composition is stronger than individual student socioeconomic status in predicting academic performance. Besides socioeconomic composition, ethnic or racial composition has also been a demographic factor analysed in school compositional research. Often ethnic compositional research comes from a sociological perspective examining segregation. There is debate whether ethnic composition is distinct from socioeconomic composition, or if it is the socioeconomic background of disadvantaged ethnic groups that explains the ethnic compositional effect. The Coleman Report, published in the US in 1966, is what established interest in the school compositional effects, and is still very influential today. It was part of the US federal government's civil rights agenda with the aim of determining the differences in the quality of schooling between Anglo and African American students. Based on a sample of approximately 500,000 students, it found that in US public schools, the socioeconomic and ethnic composition of schools were much more powerful in explaining academic performance than differences in teachers, curriculum, and school physical facilities. An interesting Australian study that compares the impact of teachers with school composition was Lamb and Fullerton, published in 2001. They looked at Australian and US data in the third International Mathematics and Science Study dataset. They found that school composition had a much greater effect size at the classroom and school levels than teacher quality or student attitudes and beliefs. Laura Perry and Andrew McConey have published a number of research articles examining the role of school composition in the Australian PISA datasets and how it compares to Canada. The graph on the right is part of their analysis of the Australian performance in the 2003 PISA dataset. In general, they found that in Australia and Canada, composition had a consistent effect across differing socio-economic backgrounds of students, but the effect may strengthen in higher SES schools in Australia, but not in Canada. You can see this in their graph as around the third quintile the slope of the line steepens. They suggest an explanatory factor may be the positive relationship between this average socio-economic status of schools and their resource levels in Australia. The higher income level of middle and high fee private schools in Australia may be giving them an added advantage in academic performance above the compositional effect. I think this is plausible. One way you could test this is to compare the compositional effect in state selective schools, such as we have in New South Wales, and high-fee private schools. Both have similar demographic profiles, but the state schools have about half the income per student. Not a lot of research has explored why school composition influences the effectiveness of schools. I'm drawn to some work by Gregory Palladie published in 2008, which posits that the demographic profile of a school moderates or influences how effective the resources and practices of a school are. It is based on an idea called contingency theory, which argues that the effectiveness of school practices vary with their social context. Palladie saw Shireen Zimboska for this concept. Using the idea of contingency theory, Palladie found that low socioeconomic schools were up to 3 times more sensitive to variations in teacher salary, school size, urbanicity, parental aspirations, and tracking. An alternative to looking at factors that may moderate the effectiveness of school practices is to look for factors that mediate or directly explain the effect of school composition to academic performance. Examples identified have included teacher expectations, peer influences, school climate, incidental learning, student safety, academic offerings, streaming classes, resources, cultural norms, parental engagement, and behavioural problems. Rumberger and Palladie in 2005 found that teacher expectations, hours of homework, number of academic courses taken, and student sense of safety explain the compositional effects impact on high school academic growth. In 2010, Willems found that the quality of instruction, student engagement, curriculum coverage, and instructional time and adequacy of school resources explain some of the compositional effect. What both moderation and mediation studies show are that schools vary in their relationship with students depending on the composition of the school body. A critical policy question is it possible to compensate or reorganise low socioeconomic schools to counter the compositional effect? Finally, just to touch on the topical issue of schools funding, what school compositional research suggests is that needs-based funding should be targeted in a non-linear fashion. In other words, funding for socioeconomic disadvantage should increase in an exponential type fashion below a particular point of average socioeconomic disadvantage.